Every child wanted to be one. Every enemy feared them. But the truth? It was hell. They were raised to feel no pain, trained to obey without question, and stripped of comfort before they could speak. By age 7, they were pulled from their homes and thrust into a world where kindness was forbidden and silence was survival. This is the true story of what it was really like to be a Spartan soldier. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet comfort of your own bed, let yourself drift back to ancient Greece, where the sound of small footsteps echoed through cold stone corridors, and childhood ended not with celebration, but with separation. The men came in the darkness, often before dawn when the streets were empty and the household still wrapped in sleep. They moved with purpose through the narrow alleys of Sparta, their sandals clicking against stone as they approached hoes where 7-year-old boys lay dreaming. There was no warning, no preparation, no chance for final words or embraces. According to Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, children were handed over at 7, and the state would have them now. Picture a small boy awakened not by his mother's gentle touch, but by the rough hands of strangers who lift him from his bed while his family watches in enforced silence. His eyes, still heavy with sleep, search for his mother's face in the dim light of the oil lamp, that she stands frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. Any tears, any protest, any display of maternal love would mark her son for punishment before his training even began. The mothers of Sparta learned to hide their hearts behind masks of stone. They were forbidden from showing emotion during these takings, as any display of tenderness was seen as weakness that could contaminate the child. A mother's tears could doom her son to harsher treatment, marking him as someone who inspired softness rather than strength. So they stood silent, their faces composed, watching as their children were led away into a world where love was replaced by discipline and comfort was replaced by suffering. The boys were marched through the streets in small groups, their bare feet cold against the pathways. While other Greek children in distant cities were waking to warm porridge and their mothers' songs, these Spartan boys walked toward barracks where silence was the first lesson they would learn. The contrast was stark and intentional. Sparta wanted its future warriors to understand from their first moments that they were different, that the comforts other children enjoyed were not meant for them. The barracks that awaited them were deliberately uncomfortable, designed to strip away any lingering sense of safety or belonging. The dormitories were overcrowded, with dozens of boys packed into spaces meant for far fewer. They slept on thin straw mats laid directly on cold floors, with no pillows, no blankets, no personal possessions of any kind. The walls were bare, the windows narrow, and the air thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and fear. Each boy was assigned a sleeping spot marked only by the worn outline of previous occupants. There were no names carved into the walls, no personal items tucked under mattresses, no letters from home hidden in secret places. Personal identity was the first casualty of the Agoge, and the dormitories were designed to reinforce this lesson every night. You were not a son anymore, not a child with a family and a home. You were a number, a future weapon, a project to be molded. The shock of this transition was not an unfortunate side effect of the system. It was the system. Spartan leaders understood that breaking down individual identity required trauma, that the sudden loss of everything familiar would leave these boys vulnerable and desperate for new structure. They became clay in the hands of their instructors, willing to accept any rules, any punishment, any hardship if it meant belonging to something again. Boys who cried during their first nights were immediately marked for harsher treatment. The instructors watched from the shadows, noting which children wept for their mothers, which ones called out in their sleep, which ones showed signs of homesickness or fear. These emotional displays were not met with comfort or understanding. Instead, they became targets painted on the backs of vulnerable children, marking them for additional punishment and isolation. The lesson was clear and immediate. Emotional expression meant survival became even more difficult. The boys learned within hours that their feelings were not just unwelcome, they were dangerous. Grief for lost family, fear of the unknown, longing for comfort, these natural responses of childhood, were transformed into liabilities that could make their already difficult lives unbearable. The dormitories buzzed with whispered conversations during those first nights, as boys shared fragments of their old lives in hushed tones. They spoke of favorite meals their mothers cooked, of toys left behind, of pets who would wonder where they had gone. But these conversations grew shorter each night, as the boys learned that remembering home made the present more painful, not less. Some boys tried to form friendships in those early days, seeking the warmth of human connection in this cold new world. But the instructors watched for signs of attachment, ready to separate any boys who showed affection for each other. Friendship was seen as another form of weakness, another tie that could interfere with absolute loyalty to the state. The boys learned to be alone even when surrounded by dozens of others. The nights were the worst. In the darkness, with only the sound of rustling straw and quiet breathing around them, the boys confronted the reality of their situation. They were prisoners in their own city, captives of their own people, sacrificed by their own families for an ideal they were too young to understand. The floors were cold against their backs, but not as cold as the growing realization that this was their life now. As weeks passed, the boys stopped asking when they could go home. They stopped talking about their families. They stopped crying in the night. This was not healing or acceptance, it was the beginning of something darker. They were learning to survive by shutting down the parts of themselves that made them human, trading their capacity for love and joy for the ability to endure. The transformation was visible in their faces, in the way they held themselves, in the gradual dimming of the light behind their eyes. They were becoming what Sparta wanted them to become, not children, but raw material for warriors. The system was working exactly as intended, breaking down their individual spirits to rebuild them as instruments of the state. This was just the beginning. The real transformation had not even started yet. The taking from their families was only the first step in a process designed to strip away everything that made them human, replacing it with something harder, colder, and infinitely more useful to a society that valued strength above all else. In a single night, childhood ended forever, replaced by a system designed to forge weapons from children. But the dormitories were only where they slept. During the day, these boys would face an even more brutal reality, one where their most basic human need would become a weapon turned against them. Food became their obsession, their currency, their weapon. Picture a child so hungry that stealing becomes not just survival, but a graded skill where getting caught meant you weren't clever enough to deserve food. The gnawing emptiness in their bellies was not an accident or oversight in the Spartan system. It was the foundation upon which everything else was built, a deliberate weapon used to reshape these boys into something barely recognizable as human. The Agoge deliberately starved boys to force them into a life of calculated theft and constant hunger. Each morning, the instructors would distribute rations that were precisely measured to keep the boys alive but never satisfied. The portions were small enough to fit in a child's cupped hands, a handful of barley, a few olives, perhaps a strip of dried meat that disappeared in 3 bites. The boys would eat their meager breakfast in silence, feeling the food settle into their empty stomachs like stones dropped into a deep well, providing momentary weight but no lasting comfort. This wasn't about teaching resourcefulness or building character through hardship. This was about creating a permanent state of desperation that would drive them to do anything to survive. The hunger was constant, a living thing that gnawed at their insides from the moment they woke until they fell into fitful sleep. It colored every thought, influenced every decision, and became the lens through which they viewed the world. Food was not nourishment, it was currency, power, and the difference between another day of suffering and complete collapse. They learned to read every pang of hunger as a lesson: steal or starve. The psychological impact went far beyond physical discomfort. Hunger rewired their brains, making them hypervigilant about food sources and suspicious of anyone who might compete for the same resources. They learned to scan every room they entered, noting where food might be hidden, who might be carrying extra rations, and how they might obtain what they needed without being detected. The Spartan system encouraged theft as a means of survival, but only if executed with perfect skill. Boys were told that stealing was not just permitted, but expected, as long as they could do it without being caught. This created a bizarre moral framework where the act of taking what belonged to others was praised, while the inability to do so successfully was condemned. The message was clear: cleverness and stealth were more valuable than honesty or respect for others' property. They were encouraged to steal from citizens, from each other, and even from religious ceremonies. The boys would slick through the streets of Sparta like shadows, their bare feet silent on the stone pathways as they searched for opportunities. They learned to read the routines of merchants, to identify which homes had food stores, and to recognize the patterns of guards and officials. Some became skilled at pickpocketing during crowded festivals, while others specialized in raiding food stores during religious ceremonies when attention was focused elsewhere. The competition was fierce and ruthless. Boys would steal from their own sleeping companions, taking whatever scraps they had managed to acquire during the day. They learned to sleep with their small possessions clutched tightly in their fists, knowing that even the boy sleeping next to them might be planning to take their next meal. Trust became a luxury they could not afford, and friendship was replaced by a constant awareness of who might betray them for an extra morsel of food. Those caught stealing weren't punished for the theft itself, but brutally beaten for their lack of skill in remaining undetected. The distinction was important and telling. The Spartan system had no moral objection to taking what belonged to others. It only objected to being caught while doing so. Boys who were discovered during their thefts were dragged before their instructors and flogged with leather straps until they could barely stand. The message was reinforced with each blow. Failure to steal successfully was a personal failing that deserved punishment. The beatings were public events, designed to shame the unsuccessful thief while providing a lesson for the others. The boy would be forced to explain exactly how he had been caught, what mistakes he had made, and how he might have avoided detection. This analysis of failure was almost as painful as the physical punishment, as it required the child to acknowledge his own inadequacy, while his peers watched and learned from his mistakes. The psychological impact was devastating beyond measure. Boys learned to trust no one, not even their fellow students, as anyone might betray them for an extra scrap of food. Friendships that had begun to form in the early days of the Agoge were systematically destroyed by the constant competition for survival. The hunger created a hierarchy based not on strength or skill, but on cunning and ruthlessness. Some boys discovered they had a talent for manipulation, learning to play on the emotions of citizens to obtain food through begging or trickery. Others became skilled at creating distractions that would allow their companions to steal while attention was focused elsewhere. The most successful learned to work in small groups, coordinating their efforts to maximize their chances of success while minimizing their risk of detection. The constant focus on obtaining food left little mental energy for other pursuits. Boys who might have been naturally inclined toward learning, art, or philosophy found their thoughts consumed by the next meal and the next opportunity to steal. The hunger was a tool of control that ensured every moment was focused on basic survival rather than questioning the system or developing independent thoughts. The irony was not lost on those who survived the system. These boys were being trained to become the defenders of a society that deliberately brutalized them, to protect citizens from whom they were required to steal, and to uphold values that were systematically destroyed within them. The hunger taught them that even the most basic human needs were privileges that had to be earned through suffering, cunning, and the willingness to harm others. As the seasons passed and the boys grew thinner and more desperate, they began to understand that this was not temporary hardship, but their permanent condition. They learned that in Sparta, even the most basic human needs were privileges that had to be earned through suffering, and that survival itself was a skill that required constant practice and perfect execution. But hunger was only the beginning of their education in deprivation. Their bodies would soon learn that warmth, shelter, and comfort were luxuries they could never again expect to enjoy. Imagine standing barefoot in mountain snow, wearing only a thin cloak, while instructors watched to see who would be the first to shiver. The cold bit through the fabric like teeth, finding every gap where the wind could enter and steal what little warmth remained. Your toes, already numb from the frozen ground, began to lose all sensation as the snow melted against your skin and refroze in the spaces between your feet and the earth. This was not an accident of poor planning or emergency conditions. This was deliberate, calculated exposure designed to strip away your body's natural responses to pain and discomfort. The Spartan system of hardening went far beyond simple physical conditioning. Boys received only one cloak per year regardless of the season, and were forbidden from wearing shoes or any undergarments beneath the thin wool. The cloak itself was barely adequate for mild weather, let alone the harsh mountain winters that descended upon the Peloponnese. When rain fell, it soaked through immediately, clinging to their bodies like a second skin that trapped the cold against their flesh. The absence of shoes transformed every step into a lesson in endurance. Their feet, initially soft and protected, became instruments of suffering as they walked across rocky terrain, through thorny undergrowth, and over surfaces that cut and bruised with each movement. The instructors watched approvingly as the boys' soles grew thick and calloused, their skin hardening into something resembling leather. This process was painful and slow, with each day bringing new cuts and bruises that had to heal while still being subjected to the same harsh conditions. Winter training exercises pushed these conditions to their absolute limits. Boys were required to sleep outdoors on beds of reeds they had to gather themselves, often in freezing temperatures that turned their breath into visible clouds and made their fingers too stiff to function properly. Plutarch, Life of Lycurgus, describes boys sleeping on rush beds by the Eurotas. The reed beds provided no insulation from the frozen ground, and the boys would wake with frost covering their cloaks and ice crystals forming in their hair. They learned to gather the reeds during daylight hours, knowing that their survival through the night depended on their ability to create some barrier between themselves and the earth that seemed determined to draw all warmth from their bodies. The psychological impact of this constant exposure was profound and lasting. Boys learned to interpret their body's signals of distress not as warnings to seek comfort, but as weaknesses to be overcome. When their teeth chattered uncontrollably, they were taught to clench their jaws until the muscles ached. When their limbs trembled with cold, they were shown how to tense their muscles to stop the shaking. The natural responses that had evolved to protect human beings from harm were systematically trained out of them, replaced by a rigid control that ignored physical distress entirely. Frostbite became a common occurrence during the winter months, with boys developing blackened fingertips and toes that marked their dedication to the system. The instructors viewed these injuries not as medical emergencies requiring treatment, but as badges of honor that demonstrated proper commitment to Spartan values. Seeking medical attention or showing signs of discomfort resulted in additional punishment, often in the form of extended exposure to the same conditions that had caused the original injury. The message was clear. Your body's signals of distress were irrelevant, and any attempt to address them was a sign of weakness that needed to be eliminated. The instructors created deliberate moral dilemmas that tested the boys' commitment to their new value system. They would place a suffering comrade in a position where helping him would provide warmth or shelter, forcing the boys to choose between their own survival and showing compassion to others. Those who chose to help were punished for allowing sentiment to override discipline, while those who ignored their companion's suffering were praised for maintaining proper priorities. These exercises taught them that human connection and empathy were luxuries they could not afford. The winter nights were particularly brutal, with temperatures dropping low enough to make survival genuinely uncertain. Boys would lie pressed against each other for warmth, but even this minimal comfort was regulated by the instructors. Too much closeness was seen as dependence, while too little cooperation could result in death from exposure. They learned to navigate this narrow path between survival and weakness, finding ways to share body heat without appearing to seek comfort or showing affection for their companions. Illness was inevitable under these conditions, but the Spartan response was to treat sickness as another form of weakness to be overcome through willpower alone. Boys who developed fevers were expected to continue their training, while those with respiratory infections were still required to sleep outdoors in the cold that had likely caused their illness. The instructors believed that the body could be trained to resist disease just as it could be trained to resist cold, and that any concession to illness would weaken the entire system. The psychological conditioning went beyond simple pain tolerance. Boys learned that comfort was not just unnecessary, but actively harmful to their development as warriors. Any desire for warmth, shelter, or relief was treated as a character flaw that needed to be eliminated through additional suffering. They were taught that their bodies were tools to be used and maintained, not homes to be cherished and protected. This fundamental shift in perspective would stay with them for the rest of their lives, affecting how they viewed not just their own needs but the needs of others. As the seasons passed and the boys grew older, their bodies adapted to the constant exposure in ways that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Their skin became thick and leathery, their circulation improved to combat the cold, and their tolerance for discomfort expanded far beyond what most humans could endure. But these physical adaptations came at the cost of losing touch with basic human needs and responses. They could no longer distinguish between genuine threats to their health and minor discomforts that could be safely ignored. Their bodies became instruments that could function despite pain, cold, and exhaustion, but at the cost of losing touch with basic human needs. They learned that in Sparta, the ability to ignore your body's signals wasn't just useful, but essential for survival. The mountain snow had been their teacher, and its lesson was simple. Comfort was the enemy, and those who sought it would not survive what was coming next. But physical hardship was only one tool in the Spartan arsenal of conditioning. Soon, these boys would discover that pain could be delivered in ways that made the winter cold seem gentle by comparison. The instructors had found more efficient ways to deliver their lessons. Listen to the sound of fists against flesh, not in anger, but as a daily lesson where pain was the teacher and endurance was the only passing grade. The sound echoed through the training yards each morning, a rhythmic percussion that became as familiar as birdsong to the boys who called this place home. But these were not the sounds of playground scuffles or childhood disagreements. These were the calculated strikes of a system that had turned violence into curriculum, transforming the natural aggression of young boys into a precise instrument of education. The Spartan boys were not just allowed to fight each other, they were required to engage in brutal physical combat as part of their regular curriculum. Each day began with the instructors dividing the boys into groups, not for cooperative learning or team building, but for organized conflict that would leave lasting marks on both body and soul. The morning air would fill with the sounds of struggle as dozens of pairs engaged in combats that had no rules beyond the simple directive to prove your strength and your willingness to inflict pain on others. These weren't supervised sparring matches with referees and safety measures. There were no padded gloves, no protective gear, no medical personnel standing by to treat injuries. The boys fought with bare fists and feet, grappling on hard stone surfaces that added their own punishment to every fall. The instructors watched from the shadows, taking notes on who showed mercy, who hesitated to strike a fallen opponent, who helped a wounded companion to his feet. These observations would later translate into additional training, additional hardship, additional lessons in the art of suppressing human compassion. The older boys were given authority to beat younger ones for any perceived weakness, creating a hierarchy maintained through violence rather than respect or earned leadership. A 12-year-old who showed fear during weapons training might find himself surrounded by older boys who had been granted permission to correct his cowardice through their fists. A younger child who cried during the night might wake to find his bedding torn apart and his small possessions scattered, with the clear understanding that his tears had earned him this treatment. This system of authorized brutality served multiple purposes within the Spartan framework. It taught the younger boys that vulnerability would be punished swiftly and without mercy, while simultaneously training the older boys to view compassion as weakness and violence as the appropriate response to any deviation from expected behavior. The instructors never had to dirty their own hands with the day-to-day enforcement of discipline. They had created a self-sustaining system where the students policed each other through fear and violence. The instructors would deliberately provoke fights by giving unequal food rations or spreading rumors designed to create conflict between the boys. They might tell one group that another had been hoarding extra food, or suggest that certain boys had been speaking disparagingly about their companions. These manufactured conflicts served as tests of character, allowing the instructors to observe how quickly boys would resort to violence and how effectively they could inflict damage on their peers. But perhaps no ritual better demonstrated the Spartan commitment to violence as education than the annual cheese-stealing ceremony at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Each year, boys were required to steal sacred cheeses from the temple altar, while guards armed with whips tried to stop them. This wasn't a simple test of stealth or speed. It was a deliberate exercise in enduring pain for the sake of proving courage. The boys who participated knew they would be caught, knew they would be whipped, and knew that their ability to remain silent during the beating would determine their standing in Spartan society. The cheese-stealing ritual transformed theft into a sacred act and pain into a form of worship. Boys would approach the altar knowing that success was measured not by whether they obtained the cheese, but by how they responded to the inevitable punishment. The guards waited with leather whips, ready to deliver blows that would leave permanent scars. The boys learned to calculate not just how to grab the cheese, but how to position their bodies to receive the whipping in a way that would demonstrate maximum courage and minimum weakness. The ritual taught them that pain was not something to be avoided, but something to be embraced as a test of character. Boys who cried out during the whipping were marked as failures, while those who remained silent were celebrated as examples of proper Spartan conditioning. The ceremony became a public demonstration of the system's effectiveness, showing the community that these boys had been successfully transformed from normal children into instruments of the state's will. The psychological conditioning went beyond simple pain tolerance. Boys learned that their bodies were not their own but belonged to Sparta, to be used and damaged as the state saw fit. They discovered that their natural responses to pain and injury were character flaws that needed to be eliminated through repeated exposure and punishment. The instructors watched with satisfaction as the boys learned to suppress their instincts for self-preservation, replacing them with an absolute commitment to proving their worthiness through suffering. Violence became their primary language for communication, problem-solving, and expressing any emotion that might arise in their carefully controlled emotional landscape. They learned to resolve disputes through combat, to show respect through their willingness to fight, and to demonstrate affection through their ability to inflict and receive pain without complaint. The subtle nuances of human interaction were replaced by the simple clarity of physical dominance and submission. The boys who survived this system emerged as young men who had been fundamentally altered by their experience. They moved through the world with the casual confidence of those who had never known safety, who had learned to view every interaction as a potential conflict, and who had been trained to respond to any challenge with immediate and overwhelming violence. They had become what Sparta wanted them to become, perfect weapons in human form, capable of extraordinary acts of courage and brutality. They learned that in Sparta, the ability to give and receive pain without flinching was the highest form of education, more valuable than literacy, more important than wisdom, and more essential than the capacity for love or compassion. But this private conditioning was only preparation for something far more public and brutal ceremonies where their pain would become entertainment for the entire community. The amphitheatre filled with the sound of anticipation as the annual Diamastigosis began, where dozens of youths would be whipped at the altar of Artemis Orphia, and silence would count as courage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone seats as families gathered to witness what they considered the ultimate test of their son's worthiness. The ceremony had evolved far beyond its original religious purpose, transforming from a sacred ritual marking the transition to adulthood into something that revealed the darkest aspects of Spartan society. The boys selected for this honor were bound to wooden posts that had been worn smooth by countless previous ceremonies. Their wrists were tied above their heads with rough rope that cut into their skin before the whipping even began. The posts themselves were stained dark with the blood of previous participants, a testament to the brutality that had become normalized within Spartan culture. The boys stood nearly naked, their bodies already bearing the scars of their training, about to receive new marks that would either define them as warriors or mark them as failures. The whips used in the ceremony were leather straps designed to tear flesh with each strike, creating wounds that would heal slowly and leave permanent scars. The sound they made cutting through the air was distinctive, a whistle that caused the crowd to fall silent in anticipation of the impact. The entire community had gathered to watch, transforming what should have been a moment of compassion into a celebration of endurance through suffering. The crowd would cheer louder for boys who remained silent, creating a theatre where suffering became entertainment and stoicism was the only acceptable response to agony. The spectators had learned to read the subtle signs of approaching collapse. cheering more enthusiastically when a boy wavered on his feet but managed to remain upright. They celebrated the trembling muscles, the streams of blood running down backs and legs, and the glazed expressions that indicated a boy was approaching the limits of human endurance. Some boys died during these ceremonies, but their deaths were celebrated as examples of perfect Spartan endurance rather than tragedies to be mourned. When a boy's heart gave out under the strain, when blood loss finally caused him to collapse and never rise again, the crowd would erupt in approval for his ultimate sacrifice. These deaths were seen as the highest achievement possible within the Spartan system, proof that the training had successfully created warriors who would literally die rather than show weakness. Parents were required to attend and were expected to show pride, not concern, if their son was selected for the ritual. Mothers who had once comforted these boys through childhood illnesses now stood in the crowd, their faces composed in expressions of satisfaction as they watched their children being systematically tortured. Fathers who had taught their sons to walk now cheered as those same legs trembled under the assault of the whips. The inversion of natural parental instincts was complete, with love redefined as the willingness to watch your child suffer for the glory of the state. The psychological trauma was intentional, designed to break any remaining connection to normal human emotional responses that might have survived the years of training. The boys learned that their most extreme suffering was not a private matter, but a public spectacle, that their pain existed for the entertainment of others rather than as a signal that their bodies needed protection. The ceremony taught them that their individual experience of agony was less important than their ability to provide satisfaction to the crowd watching them endure it. Boys who cried out or begged for mercy were marked as failures and faced additional punishment and social exile that would follow them for the rest of their lives. A single scream, a plea for the whipping to stop, or even an involuntary moan of pain would result in immediate social death within Spartan society. These boys would be shunned by their peers, rejected by their families, and excluded from the warrior class that defined their entire world. The fear of this fate often kept boys silent even when their bodies were shutting down from trauma. The ceremony created a hierarchy of suffering where the ability to endure pain without complaint became the ultimate measure of worth. Boys who lasted longer before collapsing were celebrated as heroes, while those who showed weakness early in the process were treated with contempt that would last for years. The community kept detailed records of each boy's performance, creating a permanent ranking system based on pain tolerance that would influence their future assignments and social standing. The whipping continued until the boys either collapsed from blood loss or demonstrated that they had reached the absolute limits of human endurance. The leather straps would tear through skin and muscle, creating wounds that would take months to heal properly. Many boys lost consciousness not from pain but from the sheer volume of blood they had lost, their bodies shutting down to preserve whatever life remained within them. The ritual served multiple purposes within the broader Spartan system of control and conditioning. It demonstrated to the community that their young warriors were capable of extraordinary sacrifice, it provided entertainment that reinforced social values, and it created a public standard of endurance that would influence behavior long after the ceremony ended. The boys learned that their suffering was not their own private experience, but a commodity to be consumed by others. The ceremony was preparing them for a life where death was preferable to showing weakness, where their own survival was less important than maintaining the reputation of Spartan invincibility. The public nature of the torture ensured that every boy understood that his future pain would also be observed and judged, that there would be no private moments of weakness or recovery that were not subject to scrutiny and evaluation. The diamastagosis taught them that their pain belonged to Sparta and existed for public consumption. Their bodies became instruments for demonstrating state power, their suffering became entertainment for the masses, and their silence became the only form of applause that mattered. The boys learned that in Sparta, your suffering was entertainment, and your silence was the only applause that mattered in a society that had forgotten the difference between strength and cruelty. Those who survived the ceremony believed they had earned their freedom, that enduring this ultimate test would finally grant them the independence they had been denied since childhood. But as they would soon discover, surviving the Agoge was not graduation from the system. It was merely acceptance into a larger prison with different walls. At 20 years old, when other Greek men were establishing households and beginning their independent lives. Spartan warriors found themselves moving from one set of barracks to another, trading smaller cells for larger ones, but never gaining the key to their own liberation. The stone walls that had contained them as boys now stretched wider but remained just as impenetrable, and the freedom they had dreamed of during those long nights on cold floors was nothing more than a cruel illusion. The transition from boy to man brought no relief from the suffocating control that had shaped every moment of their existence. Adult Spartan soldiers were required to live in military barracks until age 30, forbidden from maintaining the normal family relationships that gave meaning to life for every other Greek citizen. The barracks they now inhabited were larger than the dormitories of their youth, with slightly more comfortable sleeping arrangements and marginally better food. But the fundamental reality remained unchanged. They were still prisoners of a system that viewed their personal desires as threats to state security. Marriage was allowed but so heavily restricted that it became another form of torment rather than a source of comfort or companionship. After 25, men married but snuck away for one night until they could live at home at 30. The wedding night might be the only full night they would share for a decade, as the barrack system demanded their return before dawn and their presence at evening meals with their military brothers. Young brides learned quickly that they had married ghosts who appeared briefly in the darkness before vanishing back into the world of men and warfare. These brief, secretive visits created a strange form of marriage where husbands and wives remained strangers to each other even after years of union. Men would snip away from the barracks under cover of darkness, moving through the streets of Sparta like thieves stealing moments of intimacy that should have been their natural right. They learned to make love quietly and quickly, always listening for footsteps that might signal discovery and punishment. The fear of being caught spending too much time with their wives added tension to what should have been their most peaceful moments. The children born from these hurried encounters grew up knowing their fathers as distant figures who appeared occasionally like benevolent spirits before disappearing again into the masculine world of the barracks. Boys would reach their 7th birthday having spent perhaps a few dozen nights in the presence of their fathers, creating a cycle where emotional distance was passed from generation to generation. The Spartan state viewed these limited father-son relationships as beneficial, believing that too much paternal affection would weaken the boys before their military training could properly harden them. The barrack system was designed to ensure that loyalty to military brothers always superseded loyalty to family, creating artificial families bound by shared suffering rather than blood or choice. Men who had endured the same brutal training, who had stolen food together as children and bore matching scars from the same whips, developed bonds that the state considered more valuable than the natural connections between husband and wife or father and child. These military brothers shared everything: meals, sleeping quarters, equipment, and even wives in some cases when the state determined that genetic diversity or childless marriages required intervention. Personal privacy was completely eliminated in this environment of enforced intimacy and shared resources. Men slept in long rooms filled with narrow beds placed so close together that rolling over meant touching your neighbor. They stored their few possessions in communal chests where nothing could be hidden or kept private. Even their conversations were monitored by senior soldiers who reported any discussions that suggested divided loyalties or questioning of the system. The lack of personal space extended to their thoughts and emotions, which were expected to align perfectly with state interests at all times. Daily life was regimented down to the minute, with no free time, no personal hobbies, and no individual decision-making allowed. Men woke at the same time each morning to the sound of horns, ate identical meals at identical times, and spent their days in training exercises that had been planned by others and executed without variation. The hours between training and sleep were filled with equipment maintenance, barracks cleaning, and group discussions about military tactics. There was no time for reading, for music, for artistic expression, or for any of the pursuits that might have developed their individual personalities. Men who showed too much affection for their families were publicly humiliated and sometimes exiled from their military units, creating a culture where love had to be hidden like a shameful secret. A soldier who was caught spending excessive time with his wife might find himself reassigned to a punishment detail or excluded from important military operations. Those who spoke too fondly of their children or who seemed distracted by family concerns during training were subjected to ridicule and additional duties designed to redirect their focus back to their military obligations. The psychological isolation was profound and deliberately maintained, as these men had no identity outside of their military role and no emotional connections beyond their unit. They were forbidden from pursuing trades or occupations that might have given them alternative sources of meaning or pride. Their entire sense of self was built around their effectiveness as warriors, leaving them emotionally dependent on the approval of their military superiors and the acceptance of their fellow soldiers. This psychological dependence was exactly what the system was designed to create, ensuring that rebellion or independent thought would be nearly impossible. The barracks became a strange form of monastery where men took vows of poverty, obedience, and celibacy that were enforced by the state rather than chosen for spiritual reasons. Like monks, they owned nothing personally, followed strict rules about their daily behavior, and subordinated their individual desires to the needs of their community. Unlike monks, however, they had no higher purpose beyond service to a state that viewed them as replaceable tools rather than human beings with intrinsic worth. Even their most basic needs were controlled by the state in ways that would shock modern audiences, with permission required for everything from visiting family members to choosing what to eat for breakfast. The illusion of adulthood was maintained through the granting of military rank and responsibilities, but the fundamental relationship between the individual and the state remained unchanged from childhood. They were still being told when to wake, what to wear, where to go, and how to think, with punishment awaiting any deviation from the prescribed path. Adulthood brought no freedom, only a larger cage with the same restrictions and the added burden of knowing it would never end. The hope that had sustained them through childhood that growing up would bring liberation from the system that controlled them was revealed as another cruel deception. They learned that in Sparta, growing up meant accepting that you would never truly live for yourself, that your desires would always be secondary to the needs of the state, and that even the most basic human needs would be twisted into tools of control. The barracks had become their permanent home, but the state's dominion over their lives extended far beyond these walls, reaching into every aspect of their existence, including something as fundamental as the food they were forced to consume. The wooden bowls would be placed before them each evening, filled with a thick, dark substance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The smell would hit them first, a sharp, metallic odor mixed with the sour bite of vinegar that made their eyes water and their throats constrict involuntarily. Other Greeks who witnessed this ritual would step backward, covering their noses with their cloaks, unable to comprehend how any human being could willingly consume something so fundamentally offensive to every natural barn. Instinct. They drank pig's blood broth daily to despise comfort, as Xenophon recorded, turning even the most basic human need into another lesson in endurance. The famous Spartan black broth was deliberately made disgusting as part of their philosophy that pleasure in any form was weakness. The primary ingredients revealed the true nature of this dietary torture. The broth was made from pig's blood that had been allowed to coagulate into thick, dark clots before being mixed with vinegar and salt. The blood provided the base, giving the mixture its characteristic black color and metallic taste that coated the tongue and lingered in the mouth long after the meal was finished. The vinegar added a sharp acidity that burned the throat and made the eyes water, while the salt intensified every unpleasant flavor and left the drinker desperately thirsty. The consistency was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this daily ordeal. The blood would thicken as it cooled, creating a texture that was neither liquid nor solid but something unpleasantly in between. Soldiers would find chunks of congealed blood floating in their bowls, pieces that had to be chewed and swallowed while their stomachs rebelled against the very idea of consuming such a substance. The mixture had the appearance of thick mud and the texture of partially set gelatin, making each spoonful a test of will rather than an act of nourishment. Soldiers were required to eat the broth enthusiastically, and any sign of distaste or reluctance was met with immediate punishment. The instructors watched carefully during mealtimes, noting which men hesitated before lifting their spoons, which ones grimaced involuntarily, or which ones took longer than usual to finish their portions. These observations were recorded and later translated into additional training, extra duties, or public humiliation designed to reinforce the lesson that personal preferences were irrelevant to the needs of the Niederbrand state. The psychological purpose went far beyond simple nutrition or even the building of physical endurance. The daily consumption of this revolting substance was designed to eliminate any expectation of pleasure or comfort from even the most necessary activities. The Spartans understood that if they could control their soldiers' responses to something as basic as food, they could control every other aspect of their lives. The broth served as a daily reminder that their bodies existed to serve the state, not to provide them with personal satisfaction or comfort. Meals were consumed in complete silence, with soldiers focused entirely on the mechanical act of consuming their allotted portions as quickly as possible. There was no conversation, no social interaction, no moment of relaxation or community that might have made the experience more bearable. The dining halls echoed only with the sound of spoons against bowls and the occasional involuntary gag or cough as someone struggled to swallow their portion. Food was fuel, nothing more, and any attempt to find pleasure or meaning in the act of eating was viewed as a dangerous weakness. The speed with which meals were consumed was strictly regulated, with soldiers expected to finish their portions within a specific time frame, regardless of their personal ability to tolerate the taste and texture. Those who ate too slowly were suspected of sharing reluctance or distaste, while those who ate too quickly were viewed as gluttonous or overly eager for sustenance. The narrow, acceptable range of eating behavior became another area where soldiers could fail to meet expectations and face additional punishment. Any soldier caught attempting to improve the taste of his food or seeking out better provisions was severely punished for showing weakness and lack of commitment to Spartan ideals. Men who tried to add herbs or spices to their broth, who sought out additional food from civilian sources, or who showed any interest in more palatable meals were subjected to public humiliation and additional training designed to break their attachment to comfort. The message was clear. Wanting better food was tantamount to questioning the entire system that had shaped their lives. The psychological impact of this dietary torture extended far beyond the dining hall. Soldiers learned to associate the most basic human need for nourishment with suffering and endurance rather than satisfaction and pleasure. This conditioning affected their relationships with their families, their ability to enjoy any aspect of life, and their fundamental understanding of what it meant to be human. They had been taught that even hunger was preferable to the satisfaction of a decent meal. The wanting better food was a moral failing that needed to be eliminated. The black broth became a symbol of everything that was wrong with Spartan society, a culture that had forgotten the difference between strength and self-destruction. That confused suffering with virtue, and that had lost sight of the human cost of their military supremacy. The daily consumption of this revolting substance served as a constant reminder that in Sparta, even the most basic human pleasures were forbidden, and that the state's control extended into every aspect of their existence, down to the very food they were forced to consume. This dietary torture was just one more way Sparta controlled every aspect of their soldiers' existence, ensuring that even the most fundamental human needs were transformed into opportunities for suffering and dal and dars, submission. But the state's control went beyond what they ate or where they slept. It reached into the very symbols they carried, transforming even the tools of their trade into instruments of psychological control that would determine whether they lived or died with honor. Picture a mother handing her son his shield with the words, "Return with your shield," or on it, knowing she might never see him alive again. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the bronze-rimmed aspis into his arms, the weight of it familiar yet somehow heavier in this moment of farewell. The shield's polished surface reflected her weathered face, lined with years of watching sons march away to battles that claimed more lives than they preserved. She had spoken these words to his older brother 3 summers ago, and he had returned on his shield, carried home by his surviving comrades who sang songs of his courage while she wept in the privacy of her empty house. The aspis was more than just a piece of military equipment. It was a symbol that carried the weight of Spartan honor and the burden of impossible expectations. The circular shield became a metaphor for the interconnectedness of Spartan society, where individual survival was always secondary to collective strength, and where personal desires were sacrificed for the greater good of the state. In combat, to lose one's shield was desertion according to Plutarch, so brothers fought to the death over any chance of triumph. This wasn't just about battlefield courage or tactical necessity, it was about a society that valued death over survival, if that survival came with shame. The Spartans had created a culture where the worst possible fate was not death in battle, but returning home alive without your shield, marked forever as a coward who had chosen his own life over the honor of his city. The shame of such an act was considered so profound that it would contaminate not just the individual but his entire family line, creating a stain that could never be washed away. The act of abandoning one's shield, known as ritsaspia, was considered equivalent to desertion, and carried consequences that extended far beyond military punishment. The shield was heavy and cumbersome, making it the first piece of equipment that fleeing soldiers would discard to run faster from the battlefield. This practical reality became the foundation for a moral judgment that would define the rest of a man's existence. The psychological pressure was immense, driving men to fight to the death in hopeless situations rather than face the consequences of retreat. Warriors would continue fighting with broken weapons, bleeding from multiple wounds, surrounded by enemies, because the alternative returning home without their shield was literally worse than death. They had been conditioned from childhood to believe that their lives had value only as long as they maintained their honor, and that honor was measured by their willingness to die rather than show weakness. Soldiers who returned without their shields faced social exile, family rejection, and often chose suicide rather than live with the shame of survival. These men became outcasts in their own city, forced to wear different clothing that marked them as cowards, and prevented from participating in the religious ceremonies and social gatherings that gave meaning to Spartan life. They were living reminders of what happened when honor was abandoned, walking examples of the fate that awaited anyone who chose personal survival over collective duty. The isolation was complete and deliberately maintained by the entire community. Former comrades would cross the street to avoid speaking to them, merchants would refuse to serve them, and even their own families would turn away when they approached. The men who had once shared meals and training with these outcasts now treated them as if they were diseased, as if cowardice was a contagion that could spread through casual contact. This systematic shunning was designed to be so unbearable that death would seem preferable to continued existence. Families were expected to reject sons who showed cowardice, with mothers often leading the public shaming of their own children. The same women who had given birth to these men, who had nursed them through childhood illnesses and celebrated their early achievements, now became their harshest critics. Mothers would refuse to acknowledge their cowardly sons in public, turning their backs when they approached and speaking about them as if they were dead. This inversion of natural maternal instincts was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the Spartan system, forcing women to choose between their love for their children and their loyalty to the state. The shield became a symbol of the impossible choice between personal survival and social acceptance, representing the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Spartan society. Men were expected to be both utterly fearless and completely human, to value their lives so little that they would throw them away without hesitation, while simultaneously being skilled enough to survive battles that claimed Shamol. Thousands of lives. The shield represented this paradox, serving as both protection and burden, safety and trap. The ritual of shield carrying extended beyond the battlefield into every aspect of military life. Soldiers cleaned and polished their shields daily, not just for practical reasons, but as a form of meditation on their commitment to Spartan values. The act of maintenance became a reminder of their duty, a daily renewal of their pledge to return with their shield or on it. The shield's condition reflected the warrior's dedication, with any neglect or damage seen as a sign of wavering commitment. This created a warrior culture where death was not just accepted, but actively preferred to the alternative of living with shame. The Spartans had succeeded in creating men who genuinely believed that their lives had no value beyond their ability to serve the state, that existence without honor was not just meaningless, but actively harmful to Tyre, their society. These warriors had been so thoroughly conditioned that they could not imagine a world where personal survival might be valued over collective duty. The shield represented everything wrong with Spartan society, a culture that valued symbols over human life and honor over survival. The piece of bronze and wood had become more important than the man who carried it, a tool that had been transformed into an idol demanding human sacrifice. The aspis embodied the Spartan confusion of strength with self-destruction, their inability to distinguish between courage and suicidal devotion to abstract principles. The tragic irony was that the shield, designed to protect life, had become an instrument that demanded death. The very tool that should have helped warriors survive battles became the symbol that required them to die in hopeless situations. The defensive weapon had been transformed into an offensive ideology that turned men into willing victims of their own society's expectations. They learned that in Sparta, a piece of metal was worth more than the man who carried it, that the symbol of protection had become the instrument of destruction. The bronze surface that should have reflected their faces back at them had instead become a mirror that showed only the impossible standards they could never hope to meet. But for some warriors, even meeting these impossible standards was not enough to escape the crushing weight of Spartan expectations. Herodotus tells of two men shame-stricken at Thermopylae who later took their own lives, unable to bear the weight of surviving when their comrades had fallen. The rope felt rough against weathered fingers as another Spartan warrior prepared to end his life, not because of physical wounds or unbearable pain, but because he could no longer carry the expectations that had been placed upon him since childhood. The room was quiet except for the distant sounds of the city continuing its daily rhythm, unaware that another of its defenders was about to choose death over the possibility of living with shame. These were not battlefield deaths where men fell with weapons in their hands fighting for their homeland. These were private moments of desperation, where Spartan soldiers killed themselves because they couldn't live with the psychological pressure of impossible expectations. The warriors who took their own lives were often experienced veterans who had survived multiple campaigns, men who had proven their courage in combat but found themselves unable to cope with the constant demand for perfection that defined Spartan society. The weight of survival itself became a burden that some could not bear. Soldiers who returned from battles where their comrades had died often experienced crushing guilt that ate away at them like a slow poison. They would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling of their barracks, wondering why they had lived when better men had fallen. The questions began as whispers in their own minds but grew louder with each passing day. Why had they survived when their shield brother had taken the spear meant for them? What had they done differently that allowed them to return home while others were carried back on their shields? The society that had created these warriors actively encouraged the mindset that made suicide seem like a reasonable solution to psychological distress. The Spartan value system taught that survival was sometimes suspicious. The living when others died required explanation and justification. Warriors who returned from losing battles faced questioning not just from their superiors, but from their families and neighbors. The community wanted to know why they had survived, what they had done to preserve their own lives, and whether their actions had been honorable or cowardly. This cultural pressure transformed normal survivor's guilt into something far more destructive. Men who had fought bravely and followed orders found themselves second-guessing every decision they had made during combat. They analyzed their actions obsessively, searching for evidence that they had somehow failed in their duty or shown weakness that had contributed to their comrades' deaths. The logical understanding that survival sometimes came down to luck or circumstance could not compete with the emotional weight of a society that viewed living as potentially shameful. Families often supported these decisions, seeing a son's suicide as preferable to having a living coward in the family. Mothers who had once sent their sons to war with the words "return with your shield" or on it now found themselves faced with sons who had returned alive but broken. Rather than offering comfort or support, these families often reinforced the message that death was preferable to dishonor. They would speak about their suicidal sons with a mixture of sadness and pride, viewing their final choice as evidence that the family had maintained its honor even in the face of personal tragedy. The Spartan system punished return alive without honor, sometimes driving men to suicide rather than face the social exile that awaited those who were perceived as cowards. Veterans who showed signs of emotional distress were treated as weak and often chose death rather than seek help that was not available. The same society that had created their psychological wounds viewed those wounds as character flaws that needed to be eliminated rather than injuries that required healing. Men who trembled after battles, who had nightmares about fallen comrades, or who showed any sign of emotional vulnerability, were seen as failures of the training system rather than victims of it. The culture provided no support systems for emotional distress, viewing mental health as a character flaw to be eliminated rather than a medical condition requiring treatment. There were no counselors, no priests trained in comfort, no social structures designed to help warriors process their experiences or find meaning in their suffering. The only response to psychological pain was the same response given to physical pain: endure it silently or be marked as weak. This approach created a generation of men who were emotionally isolated even from themselves, unable to acknowledge their own suffering or seek the help they desperately needed. The absence of emotional support extended to their relationships with family and friends. Spartan warriors had been trained from childhood to suppress their feelings and avoid showing vulnerability, making it impossible for them to communicate their distress, even to those who might have wanted to help. They carried their pain alone, convinced that sharing it would only prove their unworthiness as warriors and citizens. This isolation compounded their suffering, creating a cycle where emotional pain led to greater isolation, which in turn increased the psychological pressure they felt. The same system that created legendary warriors also systematically destroyed them from within, consuming the very men it had spent decades training and conditioning. The Spartan military machine was remarkably efficient at producing skilled fighters, but it had no mechanism for maintaining their psychological well-being or helping them transition to peaceful life. The qualities that made these men effective in combat, their ability to suppress emotion, their willingness to endure pain, their complete submission to authority, made them unable to cope with the complex psychological challenges of surviving the wars they were trained to fight. The irony was profound and tragic. Sparta had succeeded in creating warriors who were so committed to their ideals that they would literally die rather than compromise them. But this same commitment made them vulnerable to self-destruction when they perceived that they had failed to meet impossible standards. The system had trained them to value death over dishonor so completely that suicide became a logical response to any situation where their honor might be questioned. The ultimate cost of Spartan military culture was not just the warriors who died in battle, but those who died by their own hands because they could no longer bear the weight of being Spartan. These men had been shaped by a society that confused strength with the ability to suffer, that mistook emotional suppression for courage, and that failed to distinguish between dedication and self-destruction. Their suicides were not acts of cowardice, but the final expression of a value system that had taught them to see death as preferable to any form of perceived failure. They learned that in Sparta, the only escape from suffering was death, and even that had to be earned through more suffering. The warriors who chose suicide were not escaping their pain, but completing the logical conclusion of a lifetime of training that had taught them to value abstract concepts like honor and duty over their own lives' well-being. Their deaths were the ultimate victory of the Spartan system over the human beings it was supposed to protect. The final proof that the city-state had succeeded in creating men who would sacrifice everything, including their own desire to live, for the preservation of an ideal that had consumed them completely. The legend of Spartan invincibility was built on the bones of children who never learned to comfort themselves, men who never discovered that strength could exist without cruelty, and warriors who died not just in battle, but in the quiet darkness of their own despair. Behind every story of military glory lay countless untold stories of human suffering, each one a reminder that the price of creating perfect soldiers was the destruction of imperfect human beings. The Spartan system ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own brutality, proving that a society built on suffering cannot endure. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember that behind every legend of strength lies a story of human cost. The Spartan soldier was not born fearless, but taught to hide his fear so well that even he forgot it was there. Let this quiet history remind you that true strength sometimes means choosing compassion over conquest, and that the greatest warriors might be those who never had to fight at all. Today we can honor fallen soldiers without repeating such harsh methods, building communities through connection rather than enforced brutality. Sleep well, knowing that in our modern world, we can choose comfort without shame, show emotion without punishment, and find strength in gentleness rather than cruelty.